My husband sold his father's watch without telling me. Weeks later, I learned whose funeral it paid for. I want to start with the watch itself, because for 14 years of our marriage, it sat in a small velvet-lined box on top of our dresser, and I never once questioned its place there. It was a gold pocket watch, worn smooth at the edges from 3 generations of hands, engraved on the inside case with the initials of my husband's grandfather, passed down to his father, and meant eventually for our own son. It was the kind of object that doesn't announce its importance loudly. It simply sits, quietly, as a promise about the future, until the day you open its box and find it gone. Hello. My name is Vivian, and this is the story of the 6 weeks I spent believing my husband had done something unforgivable, and the funeral, 3 towns away, that finally revealed what he had actually done. This isn't a story about betrayal, though for 6 weeks, I built an entire private case that pointed exactly there. This is a story about a woman named Ruth, who no one else remembered, a father who never deserved the watch he left behind, and the particular kind of love that chooses, quietly, to spend a family's most sacred inheritance on repaying a debt the rest of the world had already forgotten was owed. I think you should understand, before I describe the day I found the box empty, what kind of man I married, because I don't want you to imagine ours was a marriage built on easy trust from the very beginning. Nathaniel and I met in our late 20s, both of us a little guarded in the particular way people are guarded when they've learned, early in life, that steadiness isn't something you can simply expect from the people around you. He rarely spoke about his childhood in our early years together, and when he did, it came out in careful fragments rather than full stories, small mentions of a father who wasn't really around even when he was in the house, and a mother who left when Nathaniel was 7 and never fully came back into his life afterward. I learned over our years together not to press too hard on those fragments, because I could see, even in the earliest days, that some rooms in my husband's history were still too raw to walk through casually. What I want you to understand is that despite that guarded beginning, we built, over 14 years, one of the steadiest partnerships I had ever witnessed in anyone's marriage, including my own parents. Nathaniel was the kind of husband who noticed when I was quietly struggling before I said a word about it. He remembered every anniversary without a single reminder, and he had raised our son, now 12, with a gentleness and a consistency that told me, more clearly than any of his careful childhood fragments ever could, exactly how deliberately he had chosen to become nothing like the father who raised him. I want you to hold that picture firmly in your mind, because everything that follows happened underneath it, and I need you to understand exactly how much trust I was being asked to abandon in the weeks I'm about to describe. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, both of us hovering near the drinks table rather than the main crowd, and I remember being drawn to the particular quality of his attention, the way he seemed to actually listen rather than simply wait for his turn to speak. We married 3 years later in a small ceremony at a lakeside venue neither of our families found particularly memorable, though I have never once doubted, in 14 years since, that the vows we exchanged that day were spoken with complete sincerity on both sides. I remember, in the earliest years of our marriage, meeting his father exactly twice, both times at brief, awkward family gatherings where Walter seemed more interested in the television or his own conversation than in the son sitting across the room from him. I remember feeling, even then, a quiet unease about the distance between them, though Nathaniel always waved off my questions with a simple, "That's just how he is, it's fine," a phrase I've since come to recognize as the particular language children of difficult parents often use to protect the people around them from having to fully absorb the weight of what fine is actually covering for. I want you to understand that the man who sold a family heirloom without a word of warning was never, by nature, a dishonest man. He was instead a man who had learned, early and painfully, that some kinds of grief are too raw to survive being spoken about carelessly, a lesson that would resurface, in ways I couldn't have predicted, 14 years into our marriage. The watch itself had come to Nathaniel only 3 years before I found its box empty, inherited after his own father's death. A death Nathaniel had received with a complicated, unreadable expression I never fully understood at the time. His father, Walter, had been, by every account I ever gathered secondhand, a difficult and often absent man, quick to anger in Nathaniel's childhood and largely a stranger to him by adulthood, the kind of estrangement that isn't dramatic so much as simply worn smooth by years of distance, the way a river wears down a stone. Nathaniel attended the funeral out of obligation more than grief, he told me at the time, and he came home from it carrying only one physical object, his grandfather's gold pocket watch, which Walter had kept, but, as far as Nathaniel knew, never once actually worn or valued the way the watch itself seemed to deserve. I remember, too, the strange quiet Nathaniel carried in the weeks following his father's death, a quiet that felt entirely unlike ordinary grief. He did not cry at the funeral, nor in the days afterward, and when I gently asked him about it, worried he might be suppressing something that would surface later in harder ways, he told me only that he had done most of his grieving for his father years earlier, slowly, in pieces, long before the man actually died. He said it was a strange thing to bury someone you had already spent a decade mourning the absence of while they were still alive, and I remember thinking, at the time, that I understood what he meant, though I would not fully understand the depth of that particular grief until much later. I think, now, about how differently I would have understood that quiet at the funeral if he had simply told me, then, about Ruth. About the years of steady kindness that had shaped him so much more thoroughly than his own father ever managed to. I understand now that he wasn't withholding grief that day. He was simply grieving a different, smaller loss than the one everyone around him assumed he was carrying. A loss whose true shape he wasn't yet ready to name out loud, not even to me. I remember Nathaniel placing that watch in its velvet box on our dresser the week after the funeral, and I remember asking him, gently, what he intended to do with it. He said, "I'll give it to our son someday. It should have mattered to someone in this family. It might as well finally matter to him." I want you to hold on to that sentence because I think it explains more about what happened later than almost anything else I could tell you. For 3 years, the watch simply sat there, a quiet fixture of our bedroom until the morning I opened its box to show a visiting cousin the family heirloom she'd heard about, and found only the faded velvet indentation where it used to rest, empty. I want to be honest about the immediate visceral shock of that discovery, because I think it's important for anyone listening who has ever felt the particular vertigo of finding something sacred simply gone without warning. My first instinct was not suspicion. It was fear. The plain fear that we had been robbed, that some stranger had entered our home and taken the one object Nathaniel had ever spoken of with any real tenderness toward his father's side of the family. I called Nathaniel at work immediately, my voice unsteady, telling him the watch was missing, certain we needed to call the police that very afternoon. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, longer than the moment required, and then Nathaniel said, quietly, "I sold it, Vivian. I'll explain everything tonight. I promise you it's not what it looks like." And then, before I could ask a single follow-up question, he said he needed to get back to a meeting, and the call ended, leaving me standing in our bedroom holding an empty velvet box, more confused and more frightened than I had been even in the moment I thought we'd been robbed. I want to tell you what that phrase did to me. It's not what it looks like, because I think anyone who has ever heard those exact words from someone they love knows the particular quality of dread they carry. It is a phrase that promises an explanation while simultaneously confirming that whatever has happened requires one, and in the 6 weeks that followed, I turned that single sentence over in my mind more times than I could ever count, building an increasingly elaborate story around the 6 words he'd offered me and the silence that came after them. That evening, when Nathaniel came home, he sat me down at our kitchen table, and he told me, in a voice that struck me as genuinely pained, that he had sold the watch to a jeweler downtown for $4,000 and that he needed the money for something he couldn't fully explain yet. He asked me to trust him, to give him a few weeks to sort out something he described only as an old debt, and he promised, with what sounded like real desperation in his voice, that he would tell me everything once it was resolved. I want to be honest about how inadequate that explanation felt in the moment, and how quickly my mind filled in the blank spaces he'd left unaddressed. An old debt, $4,000, a family heirloom sold without so much as a conversation beforehand, let alone permission. I asked him directly whether this had anything to do with gambling, a fear that had crossed my mind more than once over the years, given how carefully Nathaniel had always avoided discussing money from his own childhood, money that had clearly been scarce and often mismanaged by his own father. He told me no, firmly, and I believe that particular denial, though it did nothing to fill the enormous gap where an actual explanation should have been. In other words, what began as a single unexplained transaction became, over the following 6 weeks, an entire architecture of suspicion I built almost entirely alone, because Nathaniel, true to his word, said almost nothing further about it, only occasionally disappearing for a few hours in the evening, with a vague explanation about handling something, always returning quieter and more distracted than when he'd left. I did not confront him again right away. I want to explain why, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has found themselves in a similar holding pattern of fear and restraint. 14 years of marriage had taught me that Nathaniel was not a reckless man, not someone who made large decisions carelessly, and some stubborn part of me clung to that history, even as the newer, more frightened part of me constructed increasingly dark explanations in the growing silence. I told myself for the first 2 weeks that whatever this old debt was, it would surely resolve itself soon, and that pressing him further would only deepen whatever shame or fear was clearly keeping him from explaining it fully. What this actually meant, in practice, was 2 weeks of watching my husband grow steadily more withdrawn, taking phone calls in the garage with the door shut, a habit he'd never had before, and coming home some evenings with red-rimmed eyes he tried, unsuccessfully, to explain away as allergies or exhaustion. I remember lying awake many of those nights, running through every possible explanation my mind could produce, each one darker than the last. A gambling debt he'd lied about, a child from before our marriage he'd never told me existed, now demanding money. Some kind of blackmail tied to a part of his past he'd never fully shared with me. I want you to understand that none of these fears came from nowhere. They came from 14 years of loving a man whose earliest chapters remained, even after all that time, only partially known to me, and from the particular vertigo of watching him sell the one object he'd ever spoken of with tenderness toward his own difficult family history. I want to tell you about the specific texture of those first 2 weeks, because I think it's easy, once a story resolves into something gentle, to forget how corrosive the not knowing actually felt while I was still living inside it. I started rehearsing conversations with him in the shower, entire imagined confrontations where he finally admitted to some catastrophic betrayal and I responded with either devastating calm or righteous fury, depending on the morning. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking at odd hours to check whether his side of the bed was empty, a habit that embarrassed me even as I couldn't seem to stop it. I remember standing in the grocery store one Thursday, entirely unprompted, suddenly unable to stop tears from gathering, and having to abandon my cart in the middle of the aisle until I could compose myself enough to finish shopping. I called my closest friend during the second week, unable to hold the weight of it alone any longer, and told her in a voice I barely recognized as my own that I thought Nathaniel might be hiding something catastrophic, something that had already cost us a piece of his own father's legacy without so much as a conversation. She listened for a long while and then asked the question I had been avoiding asking myself directly. Did I actually believe, in my heart, that Nathaniel was capable of the kind of deliberate cruelty a hidden gambling addiction or a secret family would require? I sat with that question for a long time after we hung up. And the honest answer, even in my most frightened moments, had always been no. It was never his character I doubted. It was only my own capacity to keep living inside a mystery I didn't understand month after month without a single honest thread to hold on to. There is a particular evening, about 3 weeks into this pattern, that I still think about often. Our son had a school event that Nathaniel nearly missed entirely, arriving with only minutes to spare, his eyes red in a way that told me, immediately, he'd been crying in the car before coming inside. I remember watching him settle into the seat beside me, forcing a smile for our son's sake, and feeling a fresh wave of fear at how thoroughly this unexplained situation seemed to be consuming him. Whatever was happening, it was clearly not a passing inconvenience. It was something that had reached into the deepest part of him and was refusing to let go. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who recognizes their own version of this particular waiting. The space between "I'll explain everything" and the actual explanation is one of the loneliest places a marriage can occupy, because it asks you to hold on to trust without any of the evidence that usually sustains it. I held on to that trust for 6 weeks, and I want to be honest that by the fourth week it had worn dangerously thin. I began, around this time, to notice small details I couldn't quite reconcile with the darker stories I'd been constructing. I found folded in Nathaniel's coat pocket while doing laundry a printed receipt from a funeral home 2 towns over, dated the previous week, listing a modest sum for cremation services and memorial arrangements, with no name attached that I could find on the receipt itself, only a case number. I sat on the edge of our bed holding that receipt for a long time, turning it over in my hands the way you turn over a piece of evidence you don't yet know how to interpret. A funeral home. Not a casino, not blackmail, not the gambling debt I had feared. A funeral, for someone whose name wasn't printed anywhere on the paper I was holding. I confronted him that evening, the receipt in my hand, my voice shaking with weeks of accumulated fear finally breaking its surface. I asked him whose funeral he had paid for, why he hadn't told me someone had died, why this, of all things, required 6 weeks of silence, and our family's most sacred heirloom sold without a single conversation beforehand. He went very still. I watched something move across his face that I recognized now, though I'd only seen it in smaller fragments before. A tightening around the eyes that told me, more clearly than words could, that I had finally brushed against the thing he'd been protecting. He sat down across from me, his hands trembling slightly, and he asked me, gently, if I remembered him ever mentioning a woman named Ruth. I did not. In 14 years of marriage, I had never once heard that name. He told me that evening about a chapter of his childhood he had never fully shared with me, not in 14 years. Not even in the careful fragments he'd occasionally offered about his difficult father and his mother's early departure. He told me about the years between 8 and 12, after his mother left and before his father, in his own limited and often absent way, managed to stabilize enough to provide even the most basic consistency at home. During those years, Nathaniel told me, his father worked long, erratic hours, often disappearing for days at a stretch on jobs that took him out of state, leaving Nathaniel largely to fend for himself in a house that frequently had no food in it and no adult attention to speak of. He described the house he grew up in during those years with a specificity that told me he had never let himself forget a single detail of it, even decades later. The refrigerator that was often empty except for condiments. The particular quiet of coming home from school to a house with no adult in it. A quiet he said he learned to fill with the television turned up too loud, just to have some sound in the rooms around him. He told me about the anxious habit he developed, still faintly present even now, of always checking the refrigerator first thing when entering any house, an old reflex from years of genuine uncertainty about whether there would be anything inside it. Ruth, he told me, lived 2 doors down, an elderly widow with no children of her own, who noticed, within the first few weeks of his mother's departure, that the boy 2 houses over had started coming to school without lunch and going home to an empty house most afternoons. She began, quietly and without ever making a production of it, leaving a plate for him on her back porch most evenings, and eventually, simply inviting him inside to eat at her kitchen table instead. He told me about the specific rhythm of those afternoons at her kitchen table, the same table, he said, where she'd once raised a daughter of her own who had died young, decades before Nathaniel ever came into her life, a loss she rarely spoke of but which he came to understand, much later, explained something about why she had so much unclaimed tenderness left over to offer a hungry boy from 2 doors down. She kept a tin of butterscotch candies on that table that never seemed to empty, and she taught him, patiently and without ever once making him feel slow for needing the lesson repeated, how to do long division, how to iron a shirt collar properly, how to change a bicycle tire on the back porch using tools that had belonged to her late husband. Over the following 4 years, Ruth became, in every way that mattered except legally, the parent Nathaniel didn't otherwise have. She helped him with homework. She taught him to cook the handful of simple meals he still made for our own family today, recipes I had always assumed came from some cookbook rather than from a woman I'd never once heard mentioned. She sat with him through fevers his own father was too often absent to notice, and she never once, in 4 years, asked for anything in return beyond his company at her kitchen table. Nathaniel told me that when he was 12, his father's circumstances finally stabilized enough that Ruth's daily presence in his life became less essential, and as adolescence pulled him toward friends and school activities the way it does most boys that age, his visits to her house grew less frequent, then occasional, then eventually stopped altogether. the way these things so often do, without any dramatic falling out, simply the ordinary erosion of a childhood friendship as its original necessity fades. He told me he had thought of her often over the years, with real gratitude, but had never made the effort to reconnect, assuming, the way we often assume about people from our distant past, that there would always be time to do so eventually. He told me, too, about the last time he had actually seen Ruth in person, a memory he hadn't fully revisited in years until the coroner's call forced it back to the surface. He had been 16, driving past her house with friends from the football team, and he had seen her out front watering her garden, and rather than stop to say hello, he had simply waved from the car window and kept driving, embarrassed, in the particular way teenagers are embarrassed by anything that reminds them too plainly of childhood. He said he had told himself, in the moment, that he would stop by properly next week, and next week had become next month, and next month had become, eventually, years, the way these things so often do without any single dramatic decision ever actually being made. He said the guilt of that half-remembered wave through a car window had sat quietly in him for over 2 decades, waiting for a moment like the coroner's phone call to finally demand his full attention. 6 weeks before I found the empty velvet box, Nathaniel had received a phone call from the county coroner's office in the town where Ruth had lived her final years, in a modest nursing facility she'd entered after a fall left her unable to manage on her own. She had died, they told him, with no living relatives they could locate, and among her few possessions, they had found a small stack of old photographs and a single letter, addressed but never sent, written to Nathaniel decades earlier, thanking him for the years of his childhood friendship and telling him, in case she never found the courage to mail it, that raising him, even informally, even for those few years, had been one of the great, quiet joys of her otherwise solitary life. His name and an old address, still on file from decades earlier, were the only lead the coroner's office had, and they had called him, as a last resort, to ask whether he might know of anyone willing to claim her remains and arrange a proper burial, rather than the county's default indigent cremation and unmarked plot. Nathaniel told me that reading that letter, sitting alone in his car outside the coroner's office, he had felt a grief so sudden and so overwhelming that he'd had to remain parked there for nearly an hour before he trusted himself to drive. He said the grief was compounded by guilt, an old specific guilt for having let so many years pass without ever once reaching back out to the one steady adult presence of his entire childhood, and he had made a decision, in that parking lot, that whatever it cost him, Ruth would not be buried in an unmarked county plot, forgotten by the very world she had quietly, faithfully shown up for during the hardest years of a young boy's life. He told me about the memorial service itself, small and quiet, held in a modest chapel attached to the funeral home, attended by only 4 people total. Nathaniel, myself absent and entirely unaware it was even happening, and 2 elderly women Nathaniel had managed to track down through the nursing facility's records, former neighbors from Ruth's earlier years who remembered her fondly but had lost touch decades earlier the way so many old friendships eventually do. He said one of the women had brought a photograph from decades earlier, Ruth standing in her garden in a floral house dress, laughing at something outside the frame, and Nathaniel had asked, quietly, if he could keep it, a request the woman granted without hesitation, understanding somehow exactly how much that photograph would come to mean to him. The $4,000 from the watch had paid for her cremation, a proper memorial service attended only by Nathaniel and 2 of Ruth's elderly former neighbors he'd managed to track down, and a small marked headstone in a modest cemetery, the first and only grave marker Ruth had ever had anything to do with, since her own late husband had been buried decades earlier in a plot she could no longer afford to maintain or ever visit. I asked him, once he had finished, the question that had been sitting beneath all my other questions for 6 weeks. I asked him why he hadn't simply told me all of this from the very beginning, rather than let me spend 6 weeks constructing an entirely different, entirely darker story out of his silence. He told me that in the first days after the coroner's call, he had been too consumed by his own grief and guilt to find the words to explain it properly, and that the shame of having let so many years pass without reconnecting to Ruth had made him reluctant to speak her name at all, even to me, because saying it out loud meant admitting how completely he had failed to honor what she'd once given him. And when it came to the watch specifically, he told me something that undid me more than anything else he said that evening. He said, "My father never once in his entire life gave me anything that felt like real care. Ruth gave me everything that actually mattered, every single day for 4 years, and never asked for a thing in return." When I realized what I needed the money for, using anything else, our savings, a loan, anything that didn't come from him, felt wrong somehow. It felt like giving her the smallest, most complicated kind of justice, letting the one object my father ever left behind finally do something he never once managed to do himself. Take care of someone who actually deserved it. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation, because I believe the ending matters every bit as much as the 6 weeks of fear and silence that came before it. I did not feel, as I might once have expected to feel in the moment the truth finally arrived, any relief shaped like vindication. I felt, instead, an overwhelming tenderness for the frightened, hungry 8-year-old boy Nathaniel had once been, and for the elderly widow 2 doors down who had quietly, without any fanfare or expectation of thanks, done what his own father could not manage to do for years at a stretch. I felt, too, a fresh grief of my own, for the 6 weeks I had spent constructing dark, unworthy stories about a man who had, in fact, spent that entire time honoring a debt of love so old and so quiet that even he had nearly forgotten how large it actually was. We sat at that kitchen table for a long time that night, and I found myself reaching across for his hand, the same hand that had once, decades earlier, accepted plate after plate of food from a woman who owed him nothing at all. I understood, in that moment, that I had spent 6 weeks afraid of a silence that had never once contained anything but grief and gratitude, guarded so carefully because Nathaniel did not yet trust himself to speak Ruth's name out loud without breaking apart entirely. I want to tell you about the days immediately following that kitchen table conversation, because I think they matter as much as the revelation itself. Nathaniel seemed lighter in a way I hadn't seen in the entire 6 weeks prior, as though simply saying Ruth's name out loud, in full, to someone who knew and loved him, had released a pressure he'd been carrying since long before the coroner's call ever arrived. He began, that same week, sorting through the small stack of photographs the coroner's office had given him, laying them out across our dining table one evening, narrating each one with a tenderness I had rarely heard him use about anything from his own childhood. A photograph of Ruth's garden in full summer bloom. A blurry photograph of a young Nathaniel, perhaps 10 years old, grinning gap-toothed on her back porch steps, a photograph I had never seen before and would come to treasure more than almost anything else in our home. I asked him, in the days that followed, if he would take me to see her grave, and he did, the following weekend, driving us the 2 towns over to a modest cemetery I had never once had reason to visit. I want to tell you about standing beside that small, freshly placed headstone, reading Ruth's full name for the first time, a woman I had never met, but who had in every way that mattered, helped raise the man I had spent 14 years loving. Nathaniel knelt down and rested his hand flat against the cool stone. The same gesture, I imagine, he might have once made toward his own father's grave, and felt nothing at all, and I watched him weep in a way I had never once seen from him in our entire marriage, an old, delayed grief finally given somewhere honest to go. I told our son about Ruth that same week, sitting him down at our kitchen table the way his father had once sat me down. He listened with the particular seriousness 12-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, and afterward, he asked if we could visit her grave together as a family sometimes, the way we visited his own grandparents' graves each year. I understood, watching him ask that question, that Ruth's quiet kindness, decades old and nearly lost to time, had just been given an entirely new inheritance of its own, passed down now to a boy who would never have known her name at all if his father hadn't finally found the courage to speak it. I called my own mother that same week, wanting to tell someone the full story now that I finally understood it myself, and I remember her going quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying something I have thought about often since. She said that in her own experience, the people who raise us don't always share our last names or our blood, and that the truest measure of a family isn't who is legally obligated to show up, but who actually does, day after day, without anyone asking them to. I thought about my own fortunate childhood, full of parents who had always simply been there, and I felt a fresh wave of gratitude for a woman I would never get to meet, who had quietly ensured that the man I eventually married grew into someone capable of that same steady, unglamorous kind of showing up. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed because I think they matter as much as the discovery itself. Nathaniel began speaking more openly in the months after Ruth's funeral about the difficult years of his childhood, no longer offering only careful, guarded fragments but full memories, some painful, some unexpectedly funny, all of them a fuller picture of the man I had loved for 14 years without ever fully understanding the specific debts of gratitude and grief he had been quietly carrying the entire time. I learned in those conversations that the simple roast chicken recipe he made every Sunday, the one our son had grown up believing was simply Dad's chicken, had actually been Ruth's recipe, taught to him at her kitchen table over 30 years earlier, a small, delicious inheritance neither of us had understood the full history of until then. I learned, too, that the particular way Nathaniel always insisted on packing our son's school lunch himself every single morning, refusing to let it become one more task delegated to me or to the school cafeteria, had never been the simple parenting preference I'd always assumed it was. It was, instead, a quiet decades-long vow, made without ever being spoken aloud, that no child of his would ever once wonder, the way he had wondered as a boy, whether there would be food waiting for him that day. Understanding that, I found myself watching him pack our son's lunch the following morning with an entirely new tenderness, seeing for the first time exactly what that small daily ritual had always actually been protecting. I think about those 6 weeks often now. I think about all the dark, unworthy stories I constructed out of a single unexplained receipt and a locked, grieving silence. And I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who recognizes their own version of an empty velvet box on a dresser, not every unexplained absence of something precious is evidence of betrayal. Sometimes it is evidence of a debt so old and so quietly sacred that the person paying it does not yet trust himself to speak its name out loud without breaking entirely. That does not mean my own fear, across those 6 weeks, was foolish or unearned. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters as much as the tenderness of the ending. A family heirloom, sold without a single conversation beforehand. A locked silence stretching 6 full weeks. These are not small things, and a woman who grows afraid in the face of them is not a woman failing at trust. She is a woman paying attention to her own life, and she deserves an honest answer far sooner than 6 weeks of silence ever gave me. I think sometimes about how close this story came to ending very differently, not because Nathaniel's love was ever in question, but because grief, left entirely unspoken, has a way of corroding even the steadiest trust if it's given enough silent weeks to work. I do not think Nathaniel intended to cause me the fear those 6 weeks produced. I think he simply underestimated how much a locked silence costs the person standing on the other side of it, waiting. If I could go back, I would not tell myself to simply wait, patiently, for 6 more weeks, without asking harder questions sooner. I would tell myself that a marriage cannot survive indefinitely on unexplained absences, no matter how noble the reason eventually turns out to be, and that the question I finally found the courage to ask across that kitchen table was owed to me far sooner than the 4th week of silent, escalating fear. But I would also tell myself this, and I offer it now to anyone listening who is standing tonight in front of their own version of an empty velvet box. Know your worth, and never let yourself believe that loving someone patiently means accepting an unexplained absence indefinitely, no matter how sacred the eventual reason turns out to be. Your peace matters as much as anyone else's need for time to grieve privately, and a debt of gratitude, however old, is not well served by a marriage quietly eroding under the weight of one partner's silent fear. Understand that the objects we inherit do not carry fixed meanings forever. A watch left behind by a father who never earned the love it represented can become, in the right hands, an instrument of a truer kind of justice altogether, repaying a debt the original owner never once thought to acknowledge. Consider, too, that inheritance is rarely as simple as an object passed from one generation to the next. Sometimes the truest inheritance is a value, a way of showing up, quietly transmitted not through what someone left behind, but through what someone else chose to do with it once it was finally in their hands. Nathaniel's father left him a watch. Ruth left him the character capable of deciding what that watch should actually be used for. Remember that grief which arrives suddenly, from a phone call about someone we failed to stay close to, often disguises itself as distance and unexplained silence, because shame and grief so often travel together, and shame rarely knows how to speak plainly about what it's protecting. Recognize, too, that we rarely get to choose the moment our old, unfinished debts of gratitude finally come due. They arrive on their own schedule, often through a stranger's phone call about someone we assumed we still had time to properly thank. When that moment comes, however inconvenient or however difficult to explain to the people around us, it deserves to be honored fully, even if honoring it costs us something we once assumed was permanently ours to keep. Give yourself permission, too, to grieve the weeks you spent afraid, even once the fear turns out to have been misplaced. I do not regret staying, and I do not regret the tenderness I feel now toward Nathaniel's quiet act of justice. But I also do not pretend that the woman who stood in our bedroom holding an empty velvet box, terrified and confused, deserved nothing but silence for as long as she received it. Both things are true at once, the way they so often are in a long marriage. The love was real, and so was the cost of not yet knowing how to speak it plainly and sooner. Learn, too, that some of the deepest acts of love a person can offer are aimed not at the living, but at repaying a debt owed to someone who can no longer receive a simple thank you in return. Nathaniel's silence was never about deceiving me. It was about finding a way to finally, properly honor a woman the rest of the world had already quietly forgotten, and believe, finally, that the truth behind the pattern you've spent weeks or months quietly fearing is rarely the monster your sleepless nights have built for you. Far more often, if you stay curious long enough to ask, what you'll find on the other side of that silence is not an ending at all, but a love so old, so quiet, and so overdue, that it simply needed the right moment and the right amount of courage to finally be allowed to speak its own name. I think, too, about the version of this story I might be telling you if I had let those 6 weeks of silence finally convince me that the worst was true. If I had confronted him with accusation instead of, eventually, with an open hand. I think about how easily suspicion, left entirely unchecked, could have poisoned a marriage that had, in fact, only ever grown stronger and more honest for having weathered this particular test. I do not know what would have happened to us in that other version of events. I am simply grateful, every single day, that some small stubborn part of me kept choosing patience over accusation, curiosity over certainty, even when certainty would have been so much easier to settle into. We visit Ruth's grave every spring now, the three of us together, and Nathaniel always brings a small bouquet of daffodils, the flower, he told me once, that used to grow wild along the side of her house every April. I keep the empty velvet box still, on our dresser, not as a reminder of loss, but as a reminder of what it actually held for those 3 years. Not simply a family heirloom waiting for our son, but a debt quietly waiting for the day it would finally be paid in full, by the one person who understood exactly how much it was worth. Our son is old enough now to understand the full story, and last spring, standing at Ruth's grave, he asked his father a question that undid me more than I expected. He asked whether he could have something of Ruth's someday, the way he was always going to inherit his great-grandfather's watch. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, and then he told him that he already had something of hers, something far more durable than any watch could ever be, a father who knew, deep in his bones, exactly what it costs a child to go without being noticed, and who had built his entire life deliberately around making sure his own son never once had to learn that particular lesson. I watched our son consider that answer with the quiet seriousness of a boy slowly understanding the shape of his own inheritance, one built not from gold or engraving, but from a decades-old kindness that had somehow, against all odds, found its way down to him too. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.